The expulsion of scores of Russian diplomats comes as an unprecedented response to the nerve agent attack. At a routine press conference in Beijing on Tuesday, China called for relevant countries to obey international law and avoid further escalating the dispute.
Foreign Ministry spokesperson Hua Chunying said China is attaching great attention to this current situation. She said China has been firmly opposed the use of chemical weapons. And Hua Chunying also added that China still believes that this issue should be properly handled between the UK and Russia and on the basis of getting all facts straight. Hua Chunying also said relevant countries should obey international law and basic norms of international relations and avoid further escalation and confrontation. And under the current situation, Hua Chunying emphasized that all parties should avoid Cold War mentality and confrontation and work together for world peace and stability and tranquility. And she also said that all parties should build in a new type of international relations based on mutual respect and win-win cooperation. Su Yuting, CGTN at the Foreign Ministry in Beijing.
Let's get you more perspective on these developments. I'm joined live from Johannesburg by Professor John Stremlow. He is a professor of international relations at the Wits University. Professor, can you tell us more about the global impact of the mass expulsion of Russian diplomats, should we be concerned?
Well, I think the Chinese government's point about observing international law and established norms is the right one to make, because what governments have devised over many, many years is protocols for dealing with sort of their mutual intelligence interests. Remember, these are not just diplomats that have been expelled. These are those individuals at embassies, Russian embassies, that the host government believes are intelligence officers. All countries engage in some of this, but there are protocols that have evolved so that when you get an exchange of spies, which happened in this case between Russia and Britain, that those who return to their home countries or their countries of sanction and security will be protected and not interfered with. And so to assassinate, if the British claim is in fact valid, and it seems to be accepted by the 26 countries that have also taken action against Russia, that the rules were broken in this case. And that's something that needs to be dealt with. And I think the Russians will retaliate, but then you're going to have to reach a new understanding so that people play by the rules.
To what extent does this diplomatic row point to rifts on the global geopolitical stage? What fallout do you foresee?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because this is not a return to the Cold War. I think that warning was the right one to make. It's not a return to the Cold War, but what we do have in the international system today is a deep division between what might be called liberal democracies and illiberal democracies. You just did a piece on Egypt, which had an election today, and that election cannot be considered to be open and of the nature that, say, an election in South Africa is. And this is something that nations are working out for themselves, but I think all nations have to be aware of each other's behavior in this regard, because if you have authoritarian elections that are then empowering strongmen like Putin or Erdogan in Turkey or Sisi in Egypt, they're free to act without the constraints that prevail when you have a free press and media, when you have dissent allowed, and when you have an open system, as is in the case of South Africa.
And in terms of leverage, can this spot be used as a political positive by African leaders?
Well, it's an interesting question. That leverage for what? Again, this is not the Cold War where you can play one side against the other. Clearly, the Russians are in a very provocative mode right now, interfering in other people's affairs. But I like to think that, for example, in Africa, China and the U.S. can cooperate in ways that are suitable to the Africans. It's really incumbent under these circumstances for the Africans to appeal, I think, to the major powers to explore each other's differences within the theater of cooperating for Africa, a kind of win-win-win. And it does not have to be confrontational. It does have to respect the rules, as I started with. And when for example, down here, another African country assassinates or tries to one of its former generals, as was the case in 2014, we had a real big problem when Rwanda was accused, and ultimately the perpetrators of that crime were brought to justice down in South Africa. You can't break those rules. And I think to the extent to which America and China and the European countries can cooperate in Africa, and Africans set the terms of that cooperation, then you can begin to explore how to make sure that the rules and the norms are acceptable to all stakeholders. That's what we should be reaching for.
All right. Professor John Stremlu, thank you for talking to us.